in the identification phase, the first step is identifying the business drivers that are going to affect your real estate. Notice I said the first step is not going out and looking for space. It's really understanding your requirement from your business's perspective. The way that I divide that up with companies is sort of through kind of a Venn diagram that I don't draw very well here, but there are really 4 components that you need to think about, and then several subparts. Financial is an obvious one. The most obvious is, rent, how much you can afford per month or per year, what have you, on this facility. But there are also other factors. Your operating costs. For biomanufacturing users in particular, your operating costs are actually more than your rent. And they can, even for general office users, they can impact your rent, substantially. If you don't, understand what those are, you can be, hit with some surprise pass-throughs later on during your lease. Also, I'll just call it security. You're going to be judged by the landlord by, your company's financials. Things like your balance sheet, what assets and liabilities you have, your income, your expenses, and your revenue. What percentage of your revenue is comprised of your rent. All these things are taken into very particular consideration, especially now by landlords and their lenders, to understand how they need to secure this lease to make sure that you're actually going to perform as a tenant. So understanding where you are as a company financially and where your funding comes from, what contracts you have, and where your revenue comes from, and the like, is extremely important because it's going to come up later on as a part of selling the story to the landlord or the lender, whatever the case may be, and making sure that you're not, over-securing the lease during the negotiation. Another obvious consideration is operational needs. The thing you think about first, right, is, what does my space need to look like? How many offices, how many cubes, perhaps if it's a little more of a technical facility with labs or with a data center, you're thinking about servers or you're thinking about lab benches. But in addition to that, it's, the infrastructure of the facility that you really need to consider. The mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems of the facility are extremely important to know what your needs are from the start, as opposed to waiting later on in the process where it's harder to identify and harder to negotiate if you do not understand what your needs are up front. Things like supplemental air units and high volume conference rooms like this one, or a server room, power requirements, even as simple as dedicated outlets for copiers or servers. Plumbing, particularly for medical lab users. So those are two of sort of the things that you typically think about, in any way, but there are some other parts to it. A couple other considerations, I label it strategic. Where is your company going? What's your plan? Broadly as a company as a whole, or for this particular facility, whatever the case may be, where's your funding coming from? What's your exit strategy as a company, particularly if you're an entrepreneur? That really needs to be thought about and understood before you begin the process, because we need to build the real estate, the lease in this case, around what your plan is. And there's also cultural, which you don't really think about before you start the process. But what image are you projecting to your partners and your customers through the facility? Do you want something that's going to project a more professional image, or something that's really just more of a functional image to your company? That's important. Employee retention issues are another one. If you're inside the Beltway, a good example is, do you need to be metro oriented, or do most of your people drive or whatever? So all of these considerations need to be evaluated before you go any further in the identification phase or the process. So that's really the first step. Another important step is developing the right project timeline. Most entrepreneurs in particular underestimate the amount of time it's going to take for them to become operational in a facility. It happens all the time. You start the process too late, you get down the line and you end up capitulating on issues in a lease that you should be negotiating because you just got your funding, you just got a contract, you need the facility right away. Whereas we should be, driving, using the appropriate process based on your business needs. That's not necessarily tied to something like a lease expiration. Ideally, if the process can fit within the time remaining before something like a lease expiration or a contract or funding, then that's your timeline. That's the end of the timeline. However, in some cases, you can bifurcate the process. In some cases, it may be more advantageous to even hold over in a facility if you can, even if there's some financial cost to it. If you have a month or two left and you started the process late, or you can't work out a renewal with the landlord because you didn't go through this process early enough, you may be hurt by shortcutting some other elements of the process by pushing too quickly. At the same time, you may have a couple of years before an existing lease may be ready to expire. So, but you don't necessarily time, your real estate decision to the end of that term, because there may be a lease liability takeover or a lease restructure option available for you today. So it's very important to understand that, your timing, isn't necessarily based on a real estate stopping point, an expiration, so to speak. And it's not even necessarily dictated by, a contract or something like that. That's a part of it, and that may be the overriding factor in how we develop the timeline. But it is still very important to take everything into consideration when developing it. A third step is programming the requirement. In some cases, when it's more complex, you're engaging an architect as part of your team here to manage the process, to figure out what you need, again, beyond just offices and cubes, if we're talking about office space, but truly what you need for this facility to work. And sometimes, if we're talking about an office space, it's back in the napkin, but it's still very important to go through that process, to understand what you need on the front end, in this case operationally, before we go to the next step, which unfortunately is some people's first step, but it's really the fourth step, which is aligning these needs to the real estate market. Over the last, almost decade that I've been in the business, when I started, a lot of people thought that, with the advent of the internet or the expansion of the internet, this business just became so much easier, right? You can Google office space plus name the town, and you could find, between that, driving around and asking some people, you could find, so to speak, probably 3/4 of the spaces out there. If you're talking about, office space, it's pretty easy. It's very easy for manufacturing space. Lab space, it's real easy in Northern Virginia because there is no commercially available lab space. That's something we're working on. But, that's only one piece of it. But without going through the first 3 steps in filtering, you don't have the proper filter to go through and evaluate the facilities, at least initially. And what that's going to cost you, certainly, is your time, if nothing else. And it's also going to cause you later on in the process to have to bring up issues or come through it, come up with issues with the landlord that you may be negotiating against that you didn't bring up earlier on that you should have, which can cause some concern and can disrupt the process in addition to costing you time, and it may end up costing you, the facility that's best for you. So that's the identification process. It's really 4 steps. It is identifying your business drivers. It is developing the right project timeline. It's programming your space properly, and then it's aligning what real estate options would best meet your facility from there.